Okay, today I'm going to go slightly off subject to some extent. My name is Gary Wyatt. I'm from the Crichton Carbon Centre in Dumfries, a sort of a quiet backwater in southwest Scotland, but probably not many people visit. The Crichton Carbon Centre works with, we run an MSc in carbon management. We also work with communities and organisations on transitioning towards a low carbon society. What I'd like to talk about today is about buildings, but it's about putting buildings in context, and buildings in the context of communities, and that we can build a lot of very low carbon or zero carbon homes, but if those homes are not being used effectively, as we've just heard earlier, or that people within those buildings are actually not living sustainably, then actually we're not really going to be achieving what we really need to do, which is this transition to a low carbon economy. A lot of the work we do in Dumfries is working with communities, and although I think our national governments have got the message, a lot of large organisations have got the message, we're really not seeing yet that the average person in the street is really committed, or really has, has sort of in their heads exactly what we mean by 40% by 2020 or 80% by 2050. What does really low carbon society mean for people? And we're not really seeing that in the public discussion as yet. And the sort of the challenges that leads us to is that we need to not only understand how the technology works, but we need to understand how behaviour change and how people work within the technology and how people interact with technology. I have Mr. Branson in this issue of the big issue has kindly come to the table, and he says what we need is a revolution in terms of understanding how our new society needs to work. A lot of people do talk about the need for this new industrial revolution, a new carbon revolution. And that is round about this interaction between technology and infrastructure and society and people. And when we talk about industrial revolution, what were the sort of the key components of the industrial revolution? Well, certainly we had an understanding of new technologies. We had access to fuel, or cheaper fuel in terms of coal, and we had a revolution in terms of the labour market. And you could argue that our new low carbon society needs to have those same sort of components. We need to have new technologies that work and are appropriate. We need to have a labour force which is ready, and we need to have the technologies. And firstly, in this, certainly in terms of our energy, I think there are a lot of very good talks around today about decarbonising the electricity grid, but certainly many people argue that getting the electricity grid decarbonised is probably one of the easiest things we need to do in terms of those challenges. We certainly welcome the Scottish Government's recent commitment to 8 new licences up in the Orkney Islands in terms of wind and power, but really in terms of our low carbon grid, we're really not taking that that commitment as seriously as we really need to. We do need to be committing to nuclear. Unfortunately, we're not really seeing a great deal of commitment to some of the big infrastructural low carbon technologies we need to see. The Severn and the Solway Firth Barrage, for example, don't really seem to be sort of biting as yet. Okay, so what do we mean by a sustainable community? And how do we recognise when we see it? How do we make sure that when we think about designing low carbon communities, people are able to actually access low carbon lifestyles? And I think you'll recognise the sort of our standard urban sprawl. This could be anywhere from Cornwall up to Orkney. Well, they wouldn't build this in Orkney, but anyway. And that what we're doing in these sorts of cul-de-sacs communities is really building generations of high carbon lifestyles. People are committed in these sorts of estates where density is to the point where we actually can't commit local services to generations of high carbon living. Some of the work the Scottish Government's been working on recently in terms of trying to address how do we create low carbon societies has been in the SSCI, this is Scottish Sustainable Communities Initiative, which has been, I was very lucky to be working in this project. They brought over a team of top designers from Miami, not very low carbon, but they were really there to work with local planners in Scotland about how do we design low carbon communities. An absolutely fantastic process. We had a team of designers that worked very closely with local communities, and I very strongly recommend that you go to the website and have a look at some of these designs that we're coming up with. At the same time, the Scottish Government has also recently announced the new Designing Streets guidance for street layout for all new development. These are now relevant and are now law. And Designing Streets is a radical departure from the way that we've been laying out our urban streets up till now. It sort of moves away from this standard-based approach. It's very much about design-led. It's about creating a sense of place. It's about putting pedestrians before vehicles, a sort of hierarchical structure of road networks. And I think what they recognise with the places that we love to live in, the planning system actually won't allow us to build those anymore. The planning system has become so regulated that actually the places that we love the most, it's very, very difficult, in fact impossible, to be able to build. I think you'll all recognise, the sort of the segregation sort of model that we work on at the moment, putting cul-de-sac communities away from our residential and our communities and business parks. Actually, what we need to be working towards is creating a much more integrated, mixed-use community where people are able to interact with local services. And sort of the key thing that sort of keeps coming up about this is about density. Is that for us to be able to supply the sort of services, walkable services that people want to be able to live with, actually we need the sort of the density. It's all about walking space, it's about permeability, it's about again, getting away from this highly prescriptive, it's the Red Book for standards for street design, some of you will recognise this, that sort of has these sort of very, very rigid sort of designs about how streets need to be laid out. Which sort of means that what we end up with is almost like a formulaic approach to our modern sort of urban design. What we end up with this could be anywhere in the country, very unfriendly to pedestrians, most of the houses sort of back onto these pretty unfriendly streets, they're cul-de-sac. In terms of places to live, there's no local services, public transport very difficult to get to. What's happening is we're sending out mixed messages that on one hand we want people to be able to engage on a sort of their new low carbon lifestyles, but actually what we're doing is we're making them live in places that are highly unsustainable. It's really difficult for them to be able to access that. And this, to some extent, is where we're going. This is in Texas, highly unsustainable. These households are probably relying on 2 to 3, possibly 4 cars per household as families grow up, no access to local services, and that this is exactly where we need to be getting away from. What we do have are some wonderful examples of, we know how to build fantastic low-carbon societies. This is the new town in Edra, highly permeable, very desirable places to live, very resilient in terms of the fact that this place in 100 years' time will still be a very popular place to live because it has fantastic characteristics of what we would consider to be a desirable society. Okay, I think I'll. This is, as you may recognise, this is Poundbury. Charles's attempt to create that sense of community and of society, not to everyone's taste, but again, it's a step certainly in the right direction. I think what I'd like to now sort of move on to is a little bit more detail in terms of looking at carbon and buildings. We're going to look a bit sort of at context and buildings and society. I'd like to think about carbon in buildings, and I'd like to talk a little bit about carbon and life cycles. I think you're sort of familiar with this sort of concept of this linear life cycle of carbon, and that we work through, and there was another session that's going to be on this after this, which looks at embodied energy in buildings in a lot more detail. I won't talk about it here that much, but certainly this we're familiar with the sort of linear cycle of carbon. But we can also think about this in terms of a hierarchical, in terms of how we create communities or facilitate communities to be able to live low carbon lifestyles, and that and these interventions at different levels needs to be different. We need to be engaging with individuals in terms of knowledge and skills and access and availability. We therefore need our buildings to be efficient, and people need to understand how to work in and live in efficient buildings. But above that, we need to be able to provide the sort of services that people can access to be able to live that sort of lifestyle, that one-ton lifestyle that we're thinking about. And again, at a much more regional, national level, we need the connectivity, we need infrastructure, we need the transport for people to be able to access that. Okay, so let's have a look at getting into a little bit more detail again. Some of the work that we've been doing with Historic Scotland, looking at buildings, much more detail, embodied energy, different types of building options. We all recognise that in terms of the allocation of greenhouse gases, that the residential sector is one of the top three in terms of greenhouse gas emissions of CO2. So our buildings essentially are a really good place, our domestic buildings are a really good place to start in terms of looking at efficiency. And we can argue that actually the industry, to some extent, with the implementation of the new Code for Sustainable Homes, Code Level 6, to some extent that the industry will respond to that. And although Stuart Milne's predisposition to a bit of echo bling on top of the buildings is something to be avoided, but actually, in terms of our new building stock, we'll probably get there. The question is in terms of the existing building stock. Probably at least 70% of the building stock by 2050 is going to be existing buildings, and the majority therefore, as our high carbon or low carbon emitting buildings become even more efficient, these buildings become again important places to be investing. But there's actually a very strong argument by some sectors to say that actually we need to be knocking down these old buildings because they're horrendously inefficient, and we need to be replacing them with very much more energy efficient buildings. So we wanted to go and have a look at, well, how much energy is in a traditional building, and how does it compare when you want to replace like for like. We used a couple of different methodologies. I won't go into this in too much detail, but you have two different bottom-down life cycle analysis, top-down input-output analysis, or bottom-up life cycle analysis. If you're interested in the technology, or the methodology, come and talk to me afterwards. We looked at full life cycle, so we heard earlier that some people don't include construction and maintenance cost. We did include construction and maintenance cost as well as operational energy. We took a very simple model. This is a very typical Scottish building in the borders, and we looked at sort of replacing this. No work on it. We replaced it. We refurbished it. We looked at a like replacement, and we looked at a modern Code for Sustainable 3 and a Code for Sustainable Homes 5 options. So we just wanted to see, well, what happens to the embodied energy when we want to start replacing very simple buildings. Okay, this is some of the data. This is our leave alone, very leaky buildings, wind blowing through it, very difficult to heat a traditional building. As you can see, the operational costs, heating and lighting, mainly heating, it was an oil system, is the majority of the costs of the carbon over 100-year life cycles. It took 100 years, these buildings are usually quite long-lived. We also looked at construction replacement. We can see that a fairly moderate amount of embodied energy associated with upgrading that very simple building led to a pretty radical reduction in the amount of heat that it took to heat that. And what was really interesting is that actually, when we start to think about knocking this building down and replacing it even with some really quite high-tech, low-carbon buildings, we could see that actually what we're losing, what we're gaining in operational savings, we're actually losing in terms of the fact that we need to knock these old buildings down and we need to spend a lot of time building new ones.